I'm Katherine Holland, 43, and I built my life on responsibility long before I ever wore rank. For years, I protected my younger brother, carried his pride quietly, and made myself smaller so he could feel taller. But when he let our family believe I was just riding a desk while I was signing the deployment packages his own unit depended on, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been minimized by someone you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stop shrinking yourself for someone else's comfort, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. The house had a particular kind of order to it, the kind that comes not from wealth, but from discipline, from someone deciding early on that the space inside the walls would not reflect the uncertainty outside them. We lived just outside Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, close enough to the water that the sound of helicopters in the evening was background noise, not news. The neighborhood was modest and well kept in the way military-adjacent communities tend to be. Lawns trimmed, cars maintained, a general consensus that presentation was a form of respect for whoever had to look at it. My father, Robert Holland, was an active-duty Navy, a commander, 05. He had given the institution his 20s and his 30s, and most of his 40s without appearing to grieve any of it. My mother, Stacy, managed the house the way she managed everything, with patience that never looked like effort and a precision she had never once used that word to describe. I was 8 years old in 1990. My brother Eric was 5. The morning I remember most clearly starts the way most of our mornings did. My father was deployed. He was gone more than he was home in those years, which is the condition military families learn to build around rather than resist. My mother was already dressed for work, moving through the kitchen with the economy of a woman who had executed this exact sequence 10,000 times and had stopped noticing that it required anything of her. Eric was still in pajamas at 7:15, which meant he was going to be late unless someone did something about it. I was the someone who did something about it. Not because anyone had told me to, no one had needed to say it, not once, but because it was simply the problem available in the room and I was the person who could see it most clearly. That is how it worked, from the beginning, and neither of us ever discussed it. I checked his backpack first. His reading worksheet was crumpled at the bottom, half finished, the pencil marks going faint toward the last 3 problems. I smoothed it on the kitchen table, set it on top where it could be found, and zipped the bag back up. His lunch was already in the front pocket. My mother had packed it the night before, but I checked to make sure nothing had leaked and that the ice pack was still cold. I put his shoes by the door. I waited. Keati. He drew the name out in that way he had. 2 syllables stretched into something closer to 3, the particular tone he deployed when he wanted something and was softening the ask before he made it. Shoes, I said. I handed them to him. He sat on the floor and put them on the wrong feet. I turned them around without saying anything about it. He looked up at me with the expression of a 5-year-old who knows he has been helped and is not entirely sure whether that requires thanks or whether the help is simply a property of the universe, like gravity or the morning. I walked him to the bus stop 4 houses down. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the bus pull away with Eric's face visible in one of the middle windows. He was looking at something on the seat next to him, not at me. I walked back inside and finished my own homework at the kitchen table. The long division set I had started the night before. The book report, due Thursday. I did not register what I had just done as anything other than what needed doing, which was, in retrospect, precisely the problem. What I understand now, that I did not understand then, is that I was teaching my brother a lesson I had not designed and had not consented to teach. He was absorbing something in those years that had no name yet. A lesson about how the world worked, about who cleared the path and who walked it, about which one of us would always see the problem first and which one of us could afford to wait. He was not calculating any of this. He was 5 years old, but the architecture of it was being built in the years before either of us had the vocabulary to examine it. I built it brick by brick with intentions that were entirely good and an awareness of consequences that was entirely absent. Eric, for his part, was 5 years old and completely delightful. He followed me around the house, asking questions I answered with more precision than the questions required. He laughed easily and often. He trusted me, the way children trust the structures built around them, absolutely, without examination, as a baseline condition of existence, rather than a considered choice. He was not wrong to. I had built the structure and I maintained it, and there was no reason available to him to question it. He never asked me to stop. That was not the problem. The problem was that I never thought to stop offering. By the time I was 14, my father had returned from a deployment and settled briefly back into the house with the same deliberate quiet he brought to everything. He was a warm man, in his way, but he communicated the way certain Navy men do, through data, through example, through the occasional sentence that was worth writing down. He did not lecture, he described. Over dinner one evening in 1996, he talked about a port visit to Japan, a navigation exercise, a maintenance cycle on the ship's propulsion system. He talked about these things the way other people might talk about a movie or a conversation at the grocery store, as reports from a life that made complete sense to him, offered without expectation that anyone else needed to find them as interesting as he did. At some point near the end of the meal, he said, "The Navy is the most honest institution I have ever belonged to. It always tells you exactly where you stand." He said it without emphasis, in the same register he had used for the propulsion maintenance. He was not directing it at either of us. He was just reporting what he had found to be true after 2+ decades of evidence. I wrote that down later that night in a spiral notebook I kept in the desk drawer in my room. Not dramatically, not like someone who has just heard something that will change a life. More like someone who recognizes a useful fact and wants to be able to find it again when it is needed. Eric was 11. He listened to my father the way 11-year-olds listen to adults talking about their work, absorbing the atmosphere, catching the tone, missing most of the content. That was fine. He was 11. The content would arrive for him later, in its own form, through its own channels. I joined Naval J, ROTC, in high school because it was available, and because something in me recognized the structure of it before I could have articulated what that recognition meant. By my junior year, my commanding officer, a retired chief petty officer named Instructor Boyd, told me I had the profile for a service academy application. He said it the way you say a bus is coming. Here is relevant information. Act accordingly. I applied. I went home and filled out every page of the application that same evening, the house quiet around me, my parents already asleep. Eric came downstairs for water around 10 o'clock and found me at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread in front of me. "What's that?" he said. "Application for Annapolis," I said. "Cool," he said. He went back upstairs. That was fair. He was 14. I do not hold anything against the 14-year-old version of my brother. He had his own world to navigate, the soccer team, friends, the 1,000 small daily negotiations of being a teenager, and my application to a service academy on the other side of the country was neither his concern nor his business. The 14-year-old version of Eric was a genuinely good kid. He is, in many important ways, a genuinely good man. The story that unfolded between us over the following decades is not a story about a bad person. It is a story about two people who built something between them without ever intending to build it, and then spent 10 years maintaining it without ever examining what it cost either of them. I left for Annapolis in the summer of 2000. I was 18 years old. I will not dramatize what plebe summer is, because it has been described accurately by others and dramatized inaccurately by many more. What it was, for me, was this: a sustained reduction of everything I thought I was, followed by a rebuilding that was slower and less ornamental. You find out what you are made of. For some people, that is a revelation. For me, it was closer to confirmation. I was precise. I did not stop. I finished what I started. These were not things Annapolis taught me. They were things I arrived with. But Annapolis gave them a larger surface to operate on, and that made all the difference in the years that followed. By my 3rd year, I was selected for a junior leadership position in my company. I did not campaign for it. The people making the selection looked at the available options and chose the obvious one. That was the whole of it. The phone calls home were brief and functional and warm. My mother did most of the talking. My father said less and meant more. Eric finished high school during my early years at the academy, then started college somewhere in the middle. His updates were brief when they came at all. He was fine. Things were going well. I did not push for more, and he did not offer it. In 2002, my father retired as a commander, 05, after 26 years of service. He was 50 years old. He adapted to it with the same deliberate economy he brought to everything else. In 2004, I was commissioned as an ensign, 01, at age 22. The ceremony was held at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, which felt appropriate in a way I did not examine too carefully. My mother had been crying since the parking lot. My father was in a coat and tie. Eric was 19, finishing his first year of college, and genuinely happy for me in the way that younger siblings sometimes manage when an achievement is large enough to feel entirely separate from competition, when there is no realistic possibility of comparison, only celebration. My father pinned the ensign bars on my collar with both hands. He did not speak. He stepped back. He looked at me, not the way a proud father looks in the version of this story that gets told for sentiment, not with tears or a speech or any of the expected gestures, but with the steady look of a man revising an accounting and finding the number exactly correct. He nodded once. The commissioning officer read the oath of office. I recited it without looking at the card. I had learned it the same way I learned most things that mattered, by sitting with it until it was mine. He stepped back and said nothing. That was the most he ever said, and I have thought about that moment. His face, the bars, the single nod, a great many times in the years since. I think he understood, in the particular way that people who have lived deeply inside an institution understand it, what my trajectory was going to look like. He saw it before I had any reason to name it. And saying nothing was the most honest thing available to him. Over the 16 years that followed my commissioning, I moved steadily and ahead of schedule through the officer ranks. I want to be accurate about what that means without being dramatic about it, because the drama is not the point and was never the point. The point is the work, and the work was what it was: precise, accumulated, consecutive. Briefing packets reviewed, qualification cycles completed, deployments executed and documented, evaluations written and received, decisions made in the particular silence of rooms where no one is watching, which is where most of the decisions that matter actually get made, and where the character of a career is built before anyone has a name for what is being built. I was promoted to Lieutenant Junior Grade, 02, in 2006. I was 24 years old, 2 years out of Annapolis, doing the work that junior officers do in the years when the Navy is deciding whether you will be allowed to do more of it. There is a particular quality to those early years that I recognized only in retrospect. Ansvarklines, the institution is watching, and what it is watching for is not whether you are impressive in the moments designed for impression. It is watching for what you do in the moments that are not designed for anything. The routine maintenance of a qualification, the accurate execution of a mundane report, the decision made at 0300 in a situation that will appear in no public record. These are the data points that compound into a career, and they compound whether or not you're thinking about them. In 2008, I made Lieutenant 03 at 26. Standard pace, clean record, nothing remarkable in the timing alone, only in the accumulation beginning to take shape beneath it. What was happening in parallel, on a track I was not watching with any particular attention, was Eric's entry into the Navy. He finished college in 2008, the same year I made 03, and enlisted. That surprised me briefly before it made sense. He was physically capable and highly motivated, drawn to the operational side of the institution in a way that I think was genuine from the beginning rather than performed. He completed the SWCC pipeline, Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman, the small boat special operations community that supports SEAL teams and other naval special warfare elements, which is not a path for people who give up when things become difficult. In 2010, he was commissioned as an ensign through the officer pipeline at age 25. I want to say plainly, what Eric accomplished was legitimate, and it was hard, and he earned it. He was promoted to Lieutenant Junior Grade in 2012, Lieutenant in 2014. His career was moving at a standard pace for a junior officer without a flag track record. There was nothing wrong with it. The problem was not what his career was. The problem was what he decided it meant relative to mine, and what he decided to do about that meaning. Christmas, 2012. Eric and I were in the same house for the first time in 2 years. I was a lieutenant commander, 04, promoted that year at age 30, measurably ahead of my year group. Not dramatically ahead, not in a way that required announcement, but in a way that was visible to anyone who knew how to read a promotion timeline against a commissioning date. Eric was a lieutenant junior grade, 02. My father asked about our careers over dinner, the way fathers do when they want to feel oriented inside the lives they have launched and are no longer close enough to see clearly. Eric's answers came first and ran long. He talked about exercises, about water operations, about the boats and the teams and the particular texture of his unit's daily work. He had good material, tactically interesting, genuinely specific. The kind of thing that lands at a dinner table because it is easy to picture, even for someone who has never been close to it. I gave my current assignment in 3 sentences and moved on. I talked about a deployment review cycle and a personnel reorganization I was managing, which, in the translation from military to family dinner, came out flat and abstract. His stories were louder and his sentences were longer, and by the end of the evening, the room had a substantially clearer picture of Eric's Navy than it did of mine. I had sat there and let it happen and told myself this was simply a difference in personality. He was always better at the dinner table. I was always better in the room where the actual decision was being made. Both of those things were true. What I did not examine closely enough was what I was choosing not to say and what permission my silence was quietly extending, one dinner at a time. In 2015, I was promoted to Commander, 05. One full grade above what my father had reached in his career. I say that not to diminish what my father built. 26 years of service at 05 is a meaningful and legitimate career that required everything he gave it. But because the number matters to what comes later, and because the fact of it was something I did not say to anyone, not my mother, not my father, certainly not Eric, I filed it and moved on. By 2016, Eric had been a lieutenant, 03, for 2 years, with no 04 selection on any visible horizon. At some point that year, a story calcified. My mother called on a Tuesday evening with the warm and innocent tone she uses when reporting information she finds pleasant, and mentioned that Eric had told her I worked in some kind of supply coordination. She said it sounded very important. She said she was proud of both of us. I sat with that sentence for a long moment before I responded. I considered its precise architecture. Not a lie exactly, but a redirection. An erasure accomplished through approximation, supply coordination standing in for the operations directorate, a desk somewhere standing in for the command structure I was building toward. The sentence did the specific work of replacing something complex and real with something simpler and considerably smaller. And my mother had received it the way she received most things Eric told her, warmly and without questioning it, because there was no reason available to her to question it. Something like that, I said. I moved the conversation to my father's back and whether the new car was working out. I did not call Eric. I did not correct the record. I told myself he would stop eventually. He was finding his footing in his career. He would settle into it, and the comparison would lose its charge, and he would stop needing to narrate my career as something smaller than it was. I believed this for 2 years, with genuine sincerity, the kind of belief that feels like patience, but is actually the avoidance of a harder conversation. Then I was standing 3 feet away from him at a cousin's wedding in 2018, while he gestured vaguely in my direction and told a cluster of extended family I was more on the administrative side. And I understood that he had not stopped and was not planning to stop without something changing. Walking to our cars afterward, I told him I'd heard it. He said quickly, "You know what I meant." "I know exactly what you meant," I said. I got in my car. The conversation ended there. I let it end there, which was a choice I made, and I have spent time since examining that choice, not to punish myself for it, because punishment without utility is waste, but to understand its shape and cost accurately. In 2020, 2 things happened that neither sibling discussed with the other and neither discussed with their parents. I was promoted to Captain, 06, the second most senior line officer rank in the Navy. The notification arrived on a Tuesday in my office, and I read it once and set it down and called Renata Voss, Commander, 05, Naval Personnel, the peer I trusted most, with the things I did not say in briefings, and we had dinner. That was the celebration, functional and warm and exactly what it needed to be. In the same year, Eric was passed over for Lieutenant Commander, 04, for the second consecutive promotion board. He was placed on a retention waiver, which would allow him to continue serving. He told no one in the family. I knew because I had access to personnel records. I said nothing to anyone. He was protecting his pride. I was protecting his dignity. Neither of us had asked the other to do it, and neither of us had named what we were doing. There was a family video call that fall. All four of us in separate frames, my parents in Coronado, Eric somewhere on base, me in my quarters. My framed Navy portrait was visible on the wall behind me, the rank insignia on the collar entirely readable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Eric glanced at it once during the call. He said nothing about it. He went back to describing a training rotation in the Pacific, and his voice was animated, and he told it well. The screens went dark at the end of the call. I sat in my quarters and thought about how much weight a silence can hold before it changes shape into something else entirely. On the morning of Saturday, March 8th, 2025, I drove onto Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, alone, in my personal vehicle, in civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket, a travel mug in the cup holder, the radio off. I was 43 years old. I was the commanding officer of the Operations Directorate at Naval Special Warfare Command. My office was on that base. My name was at the top of every SEAL team deployment package that had left that command for the last 3 years. My signature was on the authorization page of every one of them. I was there to complete my recurring sidearm qualification, a box on a list. A routine requirement I had decided to handle alone on a Saturday morning, without pulling a weekend duty officer, without generating the ceremony that a uniformed senior officer walking into an armory tends to produce in a command where everyone knows the rank structure. I had told myself, as I had told myself for 3 years of Saturday morning errands and command events and facility visits handled quietly, that this was professional consideration, the kind of leadership that involves not making yourself a burden to the institutional machinery when the task is simple enough to handle without fanfare. I had told myself that arriving in civvies and checking the box and leaving without a flag on the duty log was the considerate choice. I know now that some of what I had been calling consideration was something else. But I will come to that in its own time. The base was quiet in the particular way of Saturday mornings on military installations, a loosening of the normal operating tempo, a handful of vehicles where there would usually be a stream, the maintenance crew near the parade ground already at work, the water flat and gray off the Strand. I parked in a standard space near the Armory building and sat in the car for a moment with my travel mug, not to prepare myself for anything, but because I notice stillness when it occurs, and that morning had a quality of it worth pausing inside before the day began in earnest. The Armory was a functional room in the precise sense of that word. Fluorescent lights overhead, a laminate counter along the near wall, a rack of clipboards, the ambient quiet of a building where nothing decorative has ever been considered and no one has ever suggested it should be. Petty Officer, First Class Mike Devereaux was behind the counter when I came through the door. He was 32 years old, E6, SEAL qualified, assigned to NSW Command on standard weekend rotation. 32 is young for an E6, but it is not unusual in the SEAL community, where the selection and advancement process filters aggressively for people who move quickly or wash out. To his right, Chief Petty Officer Eddie Tran, E7, 37 years old, was working through a maintenance log with the particular focused calm of someone executing a task he has completed many times and has learned not to rush through. Devereaux looked up when I walked in. I was in jeans and a dark jacket. I had a travel mug. I was a woman who, according to all of the information available to him at that moment, which consisted entirely of what he could observe in the first 2 seconds of looking, could have been a spouse who had taken a wrong turn, or a base administrator who had come to the wrong building on their way to wherever administrators go on Saturday mornings. He snickered. I want to be precise about the quality of it, because precision matters more than outrage when you're telling a story that is actually true and has to be told accurately. He did not snicker with malice. He did not snicker with calculation or intent. He snickered with the casual, unconsidered certainty of a man who had already decided what he was looking at before he had finished the looking. The reflex of someone who had never encountered sufficient reason to examine his own assumptions, because his assumptions had always been close enough to correct. It was not a thoughtful error. It was the kind of error that does not require thought, which is, in its own way, the more instructive kind. Lost, sweetheart? Supply office is down the hall. Tran glanced up from the maintenance log and laughed once. A short, easy laugh. The laugh of someone who finds the comment harmless, because the situation is obviously what it appears to be, and what it appears to be is not complicated. Devereaux held out a hand across the counter. ID, please. I passed my common access card across the laminate surface. I did not explain myself. I did not correct him. I did not perform patience or suppress anything visible or decide anything in that moment about who these two men were or what their error meant in any larger sense. I held my travel mug in both hands, and I waited. He drew the card through the scanner. The system beeped twice. He looked at the screen. Navy Captain, Commanding Officer, Operations Directorate, Naval Special Warfare Command, the senior officer in their supervisory chain, the person whose name was at the top of every deployment package that had left this command for the last 3 years, the person whose signature authorized every trip either of them had taken in that period. His jaw locked, not dramatically, but quietly. The way a man's face goes when something has just permanently rearranged itself, and he understands in the same moment that he cannot go back to the side of the transaction where it had not yet rearranged. It is a specific kind of stillness. I have seen it before, in different contexts, and it always looks the same. Tran leaned over and read the screen over Devereaux's shoulder. He stopped smiling. The easy laugh from 30 seconds ago was fully gone. Neither of them spoke. Devereaux processed the weapon request in silence. He did every step correctly, checked the log, retrieved the sidearm, verified the serial number, recorded the transaction. Every required action, performed with precision and without a word, in the manner of a man who has understood that the best available path forward involves flawless execution and nothing else. I completed the qualification without incident. I returned to the counter, signed the log, and handed back the weapon. When the transaction was complete, Devereaux said quietly, without eye contact, in the tone of a man choosing his words with great care, "Thank you, Captain." It was the first time he had acknowledged my rank. It was the only thing he said. I nodded once. I walked out through the main door into the pale March morning, the air cool off the water, the base still quiet around me. What none of us had noticed throughout this entire exchange was that Lieutenant Eric Holland, 03, 40 years old, SWCC operator, stationed at NAB Coronado, was 8 feet away in the equipment bay at the back of the Armory. He was separated from the counter by a rack of tactical gear, tall enough to be a visual barrier, but not an acoustic one. He was drawing equipment for a Saturday training rotation with 3 members of his SWCC element. He had heard Devereaux's opening line. He had heard the laugh from Tran. He had heard the silence that followed the scan, the particular quality of silence that follows, the moment when something has been understood that cannot be ununderstood. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not walk to the counter to correct the record, did not say my name, did not do any of the things that would have changed the temperature of the room and made the next 3 seconds easier for anyone in it, including himself. He had known my rank and my assignment since 2022. He had simply never said it out loud to anyone who did not already know it. He stood in the equipment bay and watched me take the sidearm and walk toward the qualification range, and he said nothing. I found out later that he was there. I thought about it for a long time before I decided what it meant and what it did not mean, which turned out to be equally important. In the parking lot, I clicked my key fob and heard the car unlock. I reached for the door handle. Behind me, footsteps on asphalt, deliberate and unhurried. I turned. Eric was walking toward me from the Armory entrance. Not jogging, walking, with the paced deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is executing it without giving himself time to reconsider. He still had his Elements gear bag. He set it down on the asphalt beside my car with the particular care of someone who has just decided to stay for a while. He looked at me. He did not open with a deflection. He did not offer a joke or a question or anything that would have placed the direction of the next sentence in my hands. He opened with the thing itself, the way a person opens something when they have decided that the weight of carrying it is no longer worth what it costs to keep carrying it. "I've been telling people you ride a desk." He said it plainly, the way you set down something heavy. I looked at him. I leaned back against the car. "I know," I said. We stood in that parking lot for 40 minutes. I will not compress what happened in those 40 minutes into something more manageable than it was, because what it was, after 10 years of managed silence and curated family narratives and omissions, chosen one instance at a time, each choice rationalized in the moment as the kind thing to do, was simply 2 people saying the things that were actually true. There is no condensed version of that which preserves what it cost to say them. He explained it haltingly and non-linearly, the way honest confessions tend to move, not as a prepared statement, not with the clean arc of someone who has rehearsed it, but in the circling, doubling back way of a man trying to account accurately for something he had done without fully intending to do it. He had started, he said, because he genuinely did not know how to explain my role to people outside the command structure. The operational language was opaque to civilians. The title, Commanding Officer, Operations Directorate, Naval Special Warfare Command, carried a great deal of meaning to the people inside the institution, and very little to anyone outside it. It was easier to say something approximate and move on. Supply coordination, administrative work, something safely vague that suggested competence without requiring context. Then approximate became a pattern, and the pattern became a story. And the story became the thing everyone in the family held as real, not because it was convincing on examination, but because no one examined it, because I had never corrected it, because the story existed in the particular space that comfortable stories occupy, taken at face value, never stress-tested, maintained not through any active effort, but simply through the absence of contradiction. By the time he understood what he had built, dismantling it would have required explaining why it had been built in the first place, which was the part he could not figure out how to say, because saying it would have meant saying that I had exceeded what he had built in the same institution, and that the fact of it had been difficult enough that he had spent 10 years managing everyone's impression of it rather than simply acknowledging it and continuing. I listened without interrupting. Not because I was exercising restraint, though I was, but because I recognized the shape of what he was describing, the logic of the small choice that becomes a large one without ever announcing itself. The accumulated weight of silence chosen one instance at a time, each instance feeling like the practical option, until the practical options have added up to something you did not choose, and would not have chosen, and cannot quite account for. He told me about the 204 Passovers. He had never said it out loud to anyone in the family. Not after the first board in 2018, not after the second in 2020, not when he was placed on the retention waiver. He had carried it in silence, the same way I had carried what I knew about his boards, and said nothing, and the symmetry of that, when it became visible to both of us in the same moment, was the thing that landed hardest. Not his misrepresentation of my career, not my silence about his boards, the symmetry of it. The fact that we had both been managing in opposite directions and for different reasons, and that the managing had gone on so long that neither of us had recognized it as management. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. He meant about the boards. "Because it wasn't mine to say." A long quiet between us. Not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that comes when two people have reached something true at the same moment, and neither is in a hurry to move away from it. We had been protecting each other's stories. His silence about my career protected his pride. My silence about his boards protected his dignity. Neither of us had asked the other to carry that weight. Neither of us had named what we were doing. We had both simply been managing, and the managing had cost us something neither of us had budgeted for, which was the accumulation of a decade of conversations that could have been honest and were not. A decade of family dinners where the version of things in the room was not the version of things that was actually true. That evening I sat alone in my quarters with a glass of water at the kitchen table and went through the decade from the beginning. Not out of anger. I am not, by temperament, a particularly angry person, and even when I am, I find anger less useful as a tool than precision. I went through it out of precision. The 2016 phone call with my mother, the cousin's wedding in 2018, and the word administrative doing its heavy lifting. Every family video call where Eric's version of my career went unchallenged because I had decided each time, for reasons that made sense to me in the moment, that correction would cost more than silence. Every command function I had arrived at late specifically to avoid the moment when my name and title were read aloud. Every introduction I had declined. Every quiet entrance. What I had been calling consideration was also a form of management. I had been managing his comfort at the expense of my own record, not dramatically, not in any single gesture that could be pointed to and named, but in the accumulated pattern of 10 years of small choices that each looked reasonable and collectively looked like something else. It was not without kindness, but it was not purely kindness either, and kindness that costs you the accurate occupation of your own life is something other than purely kind. I needed to be honest about that. Later that evening I called Renata Voss, Commander, 05, Naval Personnel, the peer I trusted most with the things I did not say in briefings or at command functions or in the margins of my professional life, where the truth tends to accumulate unexamined. I gave her the account stripped to its essential structure: the armory, the scan, Eric in the equipment bay, the parking lot, the 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting. She is someone who knows how to hold space without filling it, which is a rarer skill than it sounds. When I finished, she asked exactly one question. "What do you want to do about it?" I stared at my water glass. I did not know yet. That was the honest answer. For the first time in a genuinely long time, I had no plan. I had the facts and I had the problem and I had no immediate solution that I trusted. And I sat with that, really sat with it, without trying to resolve it before I had earned the resolution. I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window. The base lights were still on. The Strand was quiet. I did not look like a woman who had been crying. I did not feel broken. I felt like someone who has finally located the fault line in something they have been walking across for years and is deciding, in careful silence, what kind of repair it actually requires, and refusing to rush that decision simply because the fracture is now visible. That, I told myself, was enough for one Saturday. In the weeks following the Armory incident, I made a decision that involved no confrontation, no formal complaint, and no announcement of any kind. I stopped hiding. I want to be specific about what that means, because hiding sounds larger and more theatrical than what I had actually been doing. And I am not interested in making what I did sound more dramatic than it was. I had not been hiding my rank or my role from my command. Everyone who needed to know what I did knew exactly what I did. The institutional machinery ran correctly. My authority was not in question. What I had been hiding was the fullness of it, from the ordinary social geography of the base, from the encounters that could have carried the weight of my record, and simply did not, because I had spent 3 years quietly engineering their absence. I had been arriving at command social functions late, specifically after the formal portion, specifically to avoid the moment when commanding officers are introduced and their roles are read aloud to the room. I had been declining certain introductions. I had been moving through the command's social life as a person rather than a title, under the cover of professional modesty, telling myself this was a form of leadership, that not making yourself the largest presence in every room was respect for the people in those rooms. What it was, I now understood, was the same impulse that had let Eric's misrepresentation stand for a decade. The management instinct turned inward, the habit of making space for other people's comfort by making yourself smaller than the record you had built. I had been doing it long enough that I had stopped seeing it. The quarterly NSW Command Social Function happened in late March of 2025. I arrived on time. I stayed for the full proceedings. When the announcer read, "Captain Catherine Holland, Commanding Officer, Operations Directorate," I stood without hesitation, and I remained standing until the applause ended. No performance, no speech, no moment of significance staged for anyone's benefit. Simply the occupation of my own record, which should have required no particular effort, and yet, after 3 years of deliberately avoiding that exact moment, required some. 2 lieutenants from Eric's SWCC element were seated at the back of the room. I did not look at them directly. I did not need to. The name Holland in that sentence was not a difficult association to make. Master Chief Petty Officer James Okafor had been at NSW Command longer than most of the commissioned officers he worked for. He was 49 years old and an E9, the most senior enlisted man in the command. A rank that in the Navy carries the title Master Chief Petty Officer and a degree of institutional authority that is real and specific and not easily quantified by anyone who has not seen it operate. He had been inside the institution long enough to know how things move through it, which things need documentation and which things need something else, and how to tell the difference. He pulled Devereaux and Tran into a brief, private meeting in his office in late March. Not a formal counseling session, not a written report, not a charge sheet or a preliminary inquiry or anything that would enter the official record. A conversation, the kind that senior enlisted leaders have when they want something understood without it needing to be documented, and when they know that the conversation will do more than documentation would. He told them what was on the record. He told them what they had scanned, what it meant, who signed what, and under what authority. He was not theatrical about it. He did not raise his voice. He was simply precise, in the way of a man who has spent 30-plus years understanding that precision lands harder than volume, and that the most effective delivery of a difficult truth is the one that requires no embellishment. "She signs your deployment package," he said. "She signs mine. Every trip you've taken out of this command in the last 3 years has her signature at the top of the authorization page. I'd think about that carefully." He dismissed them. No paperwork generated. No further action taken yet. What happened after that meeting was something Okafor understood would happen on its own, because he had been in the institution long enough to know how these things move. In Eric's SWCC element, word had traveled in the way it always travels in small commands, not through announcement, not through any formal communication, but through the quiet and persistent recalibration of people who have been given new information and are integrating it into their understanding of a structure they believed they already understood. Lunches were quieter in a specific way. Questions about me arrived with a different subtext, less casual, more weighted. The subtext of people who are now doing arithmetic they had not previously needed to do. Lieutenant Marcos Reyes, 03, 35 years old, one of Eric's SWCC colleagues, pulled him aside in the passageway after a training brief on a Tuesday in late March. He asked, without particular judgment and without any apparent agenda beyond genuine curiosity, "Why didn't you just say anything?" Eric did not have a clean answer. He told me about the question that night on the phone, and I could hear in how he described it that it was the question that had been following him around all day, that he had run different answers through his head throughout the afternoon, and none of them had satisfied him because none of them were actually true. I told him I understood that. I had been living with a version of the same question, directed at myself rather than at him, for the better part of a decade, and I had never found an answer I fully believed either. Commander Dennis Park, my executive officer, 05, 45 years old, knocked on my office door one afternoon in early April and closed it carefully behind him. He was a deliberate man, someone who had spent his career learning the difference between offering and pressuring, and who had developed a reliable sense for which one was needed in a given moment. He asked if I wanted the command to address the Armory incident formally. He held the door open, as simply as that, without leaning one way or the other. "No," I said. He nodded once. He did not ask for an explanation, and I did not offer one. The whole conversation was less than 90 seconds, which was the right length for it. When he left, I picked up the top packet from the weekly deployment schedule on my desk, opened it to the signature page, and signed it. I set it in the outgoing tray and picked up the next one. The work did not pause for any of this. The work never does. I have always found that reliable, not comforting, exactly, but reliable, which in the long run is more useful than comfort. There is a thing that happens in the aftermath of something like the Armory incident, in a command small enough that nothing stays unknown for long. People recalibrate, they adjust their understanding of the structure they are inside, and they find their footing in the adjusted version. It is not dramatic. It is mostly quiet. But it is thorough. By late March, the command had recalibrated, and I was standing in a slightly different position in it than I had been standing in before, not because my rank or my role had changed, but because the gap between what my record said and what the room knew had closed. That gap had been my own creation. Closing it was overdue. In April of 2025, Eric's AWCC element received a Pacific Training Rotation Planning package routed through the Operations Directorate. Standard procedure, every multi-element deployment package originating from NSW Command passed through the Directorate before it was finalized. My name was at the top. My signature was on the authorization page. One of Eric's petty officers set the packet on his desk without particular emphasis and without any comment, the way you set a packet on a desk when there is nothing about it that requires comment, when it is simply the next piece of administrative reality arriving in sequence. Eric sat with it for a moment before opening it. He told me about that moment weeks later. He said he had sat there with the closed packet on the desk in front of him and thought about the Armory. Devereaux's face when the screen loaded, the silence that followed, the sound of his own boots on the asphalt in the parking lot when he had decided to walk toward my car rather than walk away. He thought about Reyes's question in the passageway, which was still following him around because he had still not found an answer he believed. He thought about the fact that the truth had been in every room he had occupied for 3 years, on the packets in the command hierarchy, in the structure of every authorization that came through his element, and he had simply arranged not to look at it directly. The way you arrange not to look at something when looking at it would require you to change something you are not ready to change. I told him I thought that was honest. He said he was not sure it was anything other than embarrassed. I said that was probably where honest starts, at the moment when you are willing to call embarrassment by its right name instead of something more comfortable. Embarrassment named accurately is the beginning of something. Embarrassment renamed as confusion or circumstance is just the same problem waiting for its next iteration. In mid-April, he called and asked if we could meet for coffee on base. We met at the main galley on a Tuesday morning between our respective duty schedules. He ordered coffee. I ordered water. We sat at a table away from the main traffic, not conspicuously away, just positioned where the conversation could be what it needed to be without an audience. He talked for about 10 minutes, about the training packet, about Reyes's question, about what it felt like to have the people in his element now know something about me that they had not known before, and to understand that what they now knew was the version that had always been accurate, that the version they had known previously was the one he had arranged for them to have, and that the arrangement had been serving something in him rather than something in the facts. He talked for about 10 minutes, then he stopped. He looked at his coffee for a moment, then he said, "I think I've been making myself smaller by making you smaller." I picked up my water glass and held it with both hands and let the sentence sit in the air between us for a moment because it had earned that. Sentences like that one are rare. They take a long time to arrive. They should be allowed to take up the space they have earned. "That's the most adult thing you've ever said to me," I told him. I meant it exactly as I said it. What was happening to Petty Officer First Class Devereaux in the same weeks was something I only learned of afterward, through the indirect and imprecise reporting that moves through small commands the way weather moves, not through any single source, but arriving in pieces from multiple directions that, assembled, formed a picture. He was not, by most accounts, a bad man. He had made a fast, categorical error, the kind of error that takes less than 10 seconds to commit and considerably longer to live inside, particularly when you are living inside it in a command where the error is now known and cannot be made unknown. He was observed being more deliberate in his interactions, checking ranks before he spoke, choosing language with more care than he had before. The casualness that had characterized him, the easy, unconsidered certainty in how he moved through the armory, the quick assessment and the quicker comment was gone, replaced by something more considered. He had not spoken about the armory to his teammates, but something in how he carried himself had shifted in a way that was visible to the people who pay attention to such shifts, and in a command like that one, those people were numerous, and their attention was practiced. I did not invest a great deal of thought in Mike Devereaux. What had happened at the counter was his error to understand and navigate. The institution would handle the accountability portion through its own mechanisms, with Okafor's quiet guidance doing most of the necessary work without fanfare. My job was not to manage his reckoning. My job was to manage mine. I ran the Silver Strand alone one morning in early May. 6 miles. The water was flat, the base was visible to the north, the buildings pale in the morning light, the strand itself quiet at that hour, except for the rhythm of the surf. I did not think about Eric or the armory, or the deployment packages, or the promotion board, or what might or might not be coming. I just ran. Without the secondary layer of management, that quiet, always running background process of maintaining someone else's narrative at the expense of my own that had been underneath my thinking for so long I had stopped noticing it was there. Without the planning, without the arrangement, without the careful calibration of what to arrive at and how to arrive at it and what to do with my record when I got there. 6 miles. The water to my right, the base to my left, the morning neither warm nor cold, the air off the Pacific clean and indifferent. That is a small thing. I know it is a small thing, but if you have spent a significant portion of your life as a caretaker, if the caretaking has extended from lunch boxes and bus stops into the more expensive territory of managing your own visibility for the sake of someone else's comfort, then the absence of that management, even briefly, registers as something specific. You notice it the way you notice a sound when it stops, the particular quality of the silence where the sound used to be. I ran until I was done. Then I went back to work, which was where I'd always been best anyway, and which had been waiting with its usual patience. In late April of 2025, Eric called our cousin David Frias. David was 37 years old, a civilian software engineer living in Sacramento, a member of the extended Holland family who had heard the Desk in San Diego version of my career in one form or another for the better part of a decade. He had heard it from Eric directly at family gatherings. He had heard it, by implication, from our parents who had been working from Eric's version for years because no one had offered them another one. David had no particular reason to suspect the version he had been given was approximate. It was consistent. It came from a reliable source, or a source he had no reason to distrust. That is how these things work. Eric did not make a speech of the correction. He called David and told him he had been misrepresenting my career and wanted to set it right. He said I was a captain, Navy captain, '06, and that I ran the operations directorate at Naval Special Warfare Command, and that I signed the deployment packages for the SEAL teams operating out of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. He said it plainly and without embellishment, the way you say something when you have decided that accuracy matters more than the protection of any particular impression you have spent years cultivating. David was genuinely confused in the way of someone whose mental image of a person has just been substantially revised without warning. He had a clear and specific picture of me, a woman in uniform behind a desk, managing logistics in some approximate and unspecified sense, doing something important that did not require much further examination. The picture had been vivid enough that he had never thought to question it. Why would he? He had been given a picture, the picture had been consistent, and nothing had arrived to complicate it. "Wait," David said. "She's running the whole thing." "The SEAL deployments?" "Yes," Eric said. "Has been for a while." A silence on the line, not hostile, not complicated, simply the space of a person recalibrating a long-held image against new information, a process that happens internally and quietly and does not require narration. Then David said, "Huh?" That was enough. The correction had been made. The record, in that corner of the family's understanding, had been updated. It was a small beginning, and it was the right kind. In May, Eric and I had dinner at a restaurant off base, a civilian restaurant, not the galley, not the O Club, not any of the institutional spaces where our interactions tended to happen. Chosen deliberately, which was itself a signal, and a signal we both recognized without naming it. It was the first time we had chosen each other's company outside of family obligation or the accident of sharing a base in years. That fact said something, and we both knew it said something, and neither of us made a speech about it, which was the correct approach. We talked about our father, what he had shown us and what he had withheld, what each of us had absorbed from his example without ever examining the absorption, and what each of us had decided, without fully realizing it was a decision, at the moment it was made, to resist or replicate. He had shown us service without explaining its costs. He had shown us commitment without mapping its limits. He had shown us what a career in the Navy could look like when you gave it everything you had, and he had not shown us because perhaps he could not, that not everyone who gives everything arrives at the same altitude, that the altitude is distributed unevenly, and that the uneven distribution is not a judgment on the giving. It is simply the shape of the thing. We talked about this for a long time, moving around it from different angles, neither of us trying to arrive at a conclusion that resolved it. The conversation was honest in a way our conversations had not been for a long time. When we said goodbye outside the restaurant, there was a quality to the parting that had not been there in years. Not warmth yet, not fully, but something structural, the early framing of a foundation being built from better materials than the one it was meant to replace. Eric received formal notification in late May. His retention waiver would not be renewed. He had approximately 8 to 10 months remaining in service, at which point he would be separated with an honorable discharge. He called me on a Tuesday evening and told me. I listened to him tell me the full account of it before I said what I knew, which was that I had seen the timeline in personnel records some weeks before and had said nothing, because the notification was his to receive first and his to say out loud when he was ready to say it. He asked if I could do something. I said I could. He said he did not want me to. I said I knew. We did not need to discuss the reasoning at length. We both understood it the same way. Intervention of that kind, the kind that uses someone else's access to smooth the path for you, is a version of the old dynamic, the one we had both agreed, in the parking lot and in the galley and over dinner off base, to stop participating in. It would have been the wrong kind of help. The kind that costs more than it gives, in ways that take time to measure, but are always eventually measurable. In early June, we walked the Silver Strand together on a Saturday morning. The first time we had walked anywhere together, voluntarily in years, not driven there by obligation or proximity, or the accident of shared geography, but by the decision to go. The Pacific was to our right, the base to our left, the morning cool and quiet. The conversation covered ordinary ground for a while. Then it turned eventually to Thanksgiving, which was 5 months away. He said quietly that he wanted to tell their parents the full truth. Not just about his career, but about mine, the whole of it. Who I was, what I did, what it meant. He said it without pressure in either direction, just as a thing he wanted to do when the time came. I did not push him. I did not tell him it was about time, or that I had been waiting, or that the waiting had cost anything, though it had. I said what I actually meant. That's your call. It had to be his call. He had been managing everyone's impressions of both of us for 10 years. The only correction that would hold was the one that came from the person who had made the error. A correction that came from me would be competing narratives. A correction that came from him would be the truth, arriving at last in its own person. We walked south along the Strand with the Base to our left and the Pacific to our right, talking in the way people talk when they are no longer performing. Without subtext, without management, without the quiet background calculation of what to say and what to leave out and whose impression needs tending. The ocean had no view on any of this. That was, for the length of that walk, a genuinely useful relief. Something was coming. I could feel it in the margins, in the way certain conversations with my chain of command had ended recently, with slightly more than the standard courtesy. A quality of attention in certain meetings that carried a different weight than I was used to, a particular manner in how some communications had been phrased in recent weeks that, if you had been in the institution long enough to read those things accurately, suggested that a process was in motion that had not announced itself yet. I did not speculate about it. I did not calculate it. I did not call Renata and ask her to tell me what she knew. I filed the sense of it in the part of my mind I keep for things that are real but not yet actionable, and I went to work. A formal notification arrived in my secure inbox from the Bureau of Naval Personnel in early June of 2025. It was not a selection announcement. It was a flag. My file had been identified for review under the 07 Promotion Board category, Rear Admiral Lower Half. That is where the flag officer ranks begin in the Navy, the rank at which an officer moves from the officer corps to the flag officer corps, which is a different kind of responsibility and a different kind of authority and a different kind of accountability. Anyone who has spent enough years in the institution knows what it means for a file to be flagged at that level on that kind of board. It means something is being considered. It means the process is in motion. It does not mean the outcome is certain. Promotion boards are not certainties. But it narrows the range of likely outcomes considerably in a direction that is not subtle. I read the notification once. I close the screen. I finished my lunch, which was a sandwich and a glass of water at my desk, the same lunch I had every Tuesday. On a Tuesday morning in early June, I signed a deployment package for a SEAL team operating in the Pacific, a team I had never met and whose names I did not know and would not know. Their training review had come through my office 3 weeks prior. The mission parameters had moved through the standard loop of review and approval. Everything had been processed through the appropriate channels, and everything had been found to be in order. My signature went on the authorization page in the appropriate place. I set the packet in the outgoing tray and picked up the next one. I thought briefly about what it means to be a signature, to be the point of authorization for something this large, this consequential, this rarely directly observed by the people whose lives depend on its accuracy. There are men on that team who will execute a mission in a contested environment using equipment, intelligence, and authority that flows through a chain of decisions made by people they have never met. My decision is one of the links in that chain. The chain needs every link to be accurate. It does not need every link to feel important. The work does not ask you to feel important, it asks you to be accurate. I have always found accuracy more useful than importance, and a considerably more reliable source of whatever satisfaction the work offers. Renata and I had our regular check-in call a few days after the Bupers notification arrived. We talked about her upcoming billet rotation, which she was navigating with the characteristic pragmatism she brought to all institutional decisions. We talked about a policy brief at the Bureau that she had been working on for 6 weeks and was nearly finished with. We talked about a mutual colleague's retirement ceremony at a base on the East Coast, a man who had spent 30 years in the institution and was leaving it now in good order, which is the best way to leave it. We talked about the retirement at some length. His career, what he had built, what the send-off would look like. We did not talk about the flag on my file. Renata works in naval personnel. She had almost certainly known about it before I did. She did not raise it. I did not raise it. The warm, entirely normal quality of that conversation was its own form of communication, the kind that exists between two people who have known each other long enough to understand what silence means when it is deliberately chosen. Near the end of the call, she asked, "How are you?" Actually, I considered the question for a moment before answering, which is how I treat questions that deserve an accurate answer rather than a reflexive one. "Actually fine," I said. "First time in a while." That was precisely true. Not fine because everything had resolved, it had not entirely, not by any measure that would have satisfied a rigorous accounting. Not fine because the record was complete or the future was settled, or anything that had been broken between Eric and me had been fully repaired. Fine because I had stopped waiting for resolution before I allowed myself to be fine. That was the change. The fineness was not a product of the circumstances. It was a decision made independently of them. A decision to occupy the present conditions as they were, rather than as I had been waiting for them to become. That distinction sounds simple. It took me considerably longer than it should have to understand it. One evening in early June, I sat at the kitchen table at home with a book I did not make much progress in. 3 pages, possibly 4. The Buper's notification was in the back of my mind, not the front, not demanding attention. Just present the way significant things are present when you have chosen not to make them the center of every room, but have not pretended they do not exist. I thought about Eric on the Strand, walking beside me on a Saturday morning with the Pacific to our right, saying what he wanted to do about Thanksgiving in the simple declarative way he had arrived at after 40 years of practice. I thought about my father's face at the commissioning in 2004, the steady look, the nod, the 2 hands on the bars, and then the stepping back, and then the silence that said more than a speech would have. I thought about what it would mean to call him with news that exceeded what he had reached. He had retired as a commander, 05. I was being considered for 07. 2 full grades, a different kind of altitude than anything we had mapped when we were standing in a parking lot in 2004, watching the bars go on for the first time, the base quiet around us, the water flat and gray off the Strand. I closed the book. I went to bed. Whatever was coming whether I stayed up for it or not. That had been true every night of my career, and it had remained true every morning after, and I had never found a reason to act as though it would change. The formal notification arrived in the second week of June 2025. I was selected for promotion to Rear Admiral Lower Half, 07, and simultaneously designated as the incoming commander of Carrier Strike Group 5, the largest command of my career. A flag rank assignment of a kind that places you among a fraction of everyone who has ever worn the uniform. In the category of officers who have been given responsibility for a formation that includes multiple ships, multiple aircraft squadrons, thousands of personnel, and the authority and accountability that goes with commanding all of it in a contested operational environment. I read the document at my desk. I set it down, I picked it up and read it again. Then I called Renata Voss. "It came through," I said. "I know," she said. "I've known for a week. I wanted you to hear it from the official notice, not me." A brief silence, the kind that has weight in it, not discomfort, not uncertainty, but weight. The kind you sit inside for a moment before you know what to do with it, because you cannot move through it, only wait for it to settle into its proper shape. I thought about the Saturday in March, the personal car, the jeans, the dark jacket, the travel mug with the radio off, the box on a list that needed checking, the sidearm qualification I had gone to handle quietly and alone, without ceremony, because I had spent 3 years deciding that ceremony was an imposition, that making my record visible was the same as making myself a burden. That consideration and management and the quiet occupation of the smallest possible space were, taken together, a form of leadership. I thought about the laminate counter and the scanner that beeped twice. The face of a 32-year-old man was still going when he understood what was on the screen. The 12 words that came at the end, "Thank you, Captain," offered quietly and without eye contact, the only 12 words available to him by that point in the transaction. I had not planned any of what followed from that morning. The record was already there. It had been building for 20 years, one deployment and one evaluation and one command decision at a time. I had simply, finally, stopped apologizing for it. In the same week as the selection notification, a sealed envelope arrived through official inter-command mail. formally addressed to Captain Catherine Holland, which was my title at the time the letter was written, correctly applied. From Petty Officer First Class Michael Devereaux. Navy letter format, correct heading, correct salutation, correct closing. 2 paragraphs, precisely structured, no rhetorical flourish, and no excess. He said he had been wrong in his assumption. He said he had been wrong in his language. He said he was sorry. He said it in 2 paragraphs, with correct letter format and no excuses. No explanation of what he had been thinking that morning. No context offered to mitigate the error. No suggestion that circumstances or fatigue or the early hour or anything else had contributed to what happened. Just the acknowledgement and the apology, clearly stated and correctly formatted and delivered through the appropriate official channels. That last part mattered. He had not sent it informally. He had written it the right way and sent it the right way, which meant he understood what he was accounting for. I read it twice. I filed it. I did not make a monument of it, but I did not throw it away either. I called Eric the following day. I told him about the selection and the command designation. He was quiet for a long moment, longer than I expected, though I am not sure what I expected. "Carrier Strike Group 5, he said. "Yes." That's a big command, Katie. I know. By Thanksgiving 2025, something in Eric had finally settled into the shape of truth. When he told me he was proud of me, there was no performance in it. No old instinct to cover discomfort with loyalty. No second meaning underneath the words. He said it plainly, and for once the sentence did not have to carry anything except itself. That Thanksgiving dinner happened in the same house that had held nearly every important family moment I could remember. Same table, same chairs, my father carving the turkey with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. My mother filling the room with the steady warmth that had always kept the family connected. Eric was 41, close to leaving the Navy, and everyone knew it. But that was not the center of the evening. Partway through dinner, he set down his fork and corrected the record. He told our parents what I actually did. He told them about my command, my rank, my responsibility, and what it meant for my signature to sit at the bottom of deployment packages. He used the right titles. He did not exaggerate, explain around it, or make a scene. He simply replaced the smaller version of my career with the accurate one, after years of letting everyone live with an easier lie. My father understood slowly but completely. He realized I had been running operations for years. Then he understood that I was going from that role to a strike group command as a rear admiral. He had retired as a commander. I had climbed 2 full grades beyond that. He did not resist the math. He did not diminish it. He sat with it, placed it beside everything he knew, and nodded. It was the same nod he had given me at my commissioning, but this time there was something revised inside it. Recognition, corrected by new information. My mother cried, because that is what she does when something matters, and in that moment, it was exactly right. After dinner, Eric and I washed dishes together. He washed, I dried, just as we had done since childhood. We did not revisit the Armory, the parking lot, the years of misrepresentation, or the phone calls where I had let the false version stand. Those conversations had already happened. Saying them again would not make them more true. What remained was quieter, a plate handed over, a towel on the oven handle, the base lights outside the window, my parents' voices carried from the next room, and what I understood then was simple. Making yourself smaller for someone else's comfort is not kindness. It is a loan nobody asked for and nobody will repay. It costs you the truth of your own life. So stand inside what you built. Walk into the room on time. Let your name be said. Let the room adjust. The record can carry the weight. It was built to. Then we went to join them, and the evening went on, and that's what I carried with me after that night. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to stop disappearing from my own life. Have you ever had to choose yourself after years of staying quiet? Have you ever realized you were making yourself smaller just to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, and if this story meant something to you, like, subscribe and come back for more stories about standing up, setting boundaries, and taking your life back.